All right, everyone, welcome to Course 1. This is an intro to population and climate change. So population connection obviously looks at the various implications of population growth throughout the world in both environmental and human rights contexts. And more recently, we've really become engaged in the implications that rapid population growth have on climate change, not only in terms of emissions, but also in terms of climate vulnerability and issues of inequality that are pervasive throughout some of the most marginalized places on Earth. So today we're going to discuss what exactly that means. And just before we get started, I don't know, I think a lot of you are members, and that's amazing. But for those of you who aren't, Population Connection is a US-based nonprofit organization that advocates for increased US funding for family planning programs internationally. And in addition to a lot of the advocacy work we do, we are also very invested in education and outreach, specifically surrounding some of the major connections between population growth, access to healthcare, and environmental sustainability. So as an environmental organization, we are very interested in understanding and educating the public about the different ways that humans impact the planet. And as a human rights-based organization, we're very invested in understanding the root causes of rapid population growth, but specifically within the context of reproductive autonomy. So we know that when women and children and families have access to resources, and in particular reproductive health care, fertility rates naturally drop. More women go to school and obtain sustained employment. Women, children, and families are ultimately healthier overall. And all of that is very foundational to sustainable development platforms worldwide. Additionally, what our organization utilizes a PHE approach to development structures. So that's a population health and environment development approach. And that actually means that we sort of strive to educate about the very interconnected nature of environmental sustainability and public health. So often whenever we are looking at the sort of underlying issues surrounding human-induced environmental problems like habitat destruction or deforestation, they can ultimately be traced back to issues of poverty, of marginalization, of lack of access to public health or economic opportunity or so forth. And so by increasing access to public health, to family planning education, to economic opportunity, to access to resources more generally, we can promote sort of community-based environmental sustainability platforms and conservation while also increasing the levels of overall health for humans, animals, and the environment. And this we'll get into a little bit later if it seems a bit abstract right now. But more and more what we're realizing, especially with this pandemic, is that the health of humanity is very much intertwined and dependent on the health of the planet. Okay, and so this course is very much about climate change. And of course, this is probably not news to you. If you read even just a small bit of news, you're very well aware that climate change is a very imminent problem that is being felt globally already throughout the world. And the planet's warmest years on record were actually from 2015 to 2019. And scientists have been warning for a really long time that global warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius is going to cause large-scale environmental damage. And warming beyond 2 degrees Celsius is basically going to create a very inhabitable planet. But despite this, global anthropogenic emissions are not actually expected to peak even by 2030. And scientists are estimating that the climate impacts that are hitting faster and stronger than previously estimated even 10 years ago. And so it's important also to remember that in terms of emissions, regardless of the trajectory of future emissions trends, the warming that has already resulted from emissions produced from pre-industrial periods to now will continue for hundreds of thousands of years. So this is a very large problem, large scale. It's going to impact everyone. It already is. And the actions that we implement now will have a very large impact on whether or not we're going to be able to kind of mitigate the damage caused by this sort of cascading problem. And this is just a picture put forth by the IPCC that's looking at the global trends in temperatures. And as you can see, there's a large portion of the planet that has seen record temperature increases in 2019. And again, this is created by the IPCC to show the effects of mitigation versus non-mitigation. And again, because climate change is such that we can, the actions we implement now will have drastic results for the future. If we don't take actions, the effects will be cascading. They will sort of amplify over time and be, and our actions will be much less impactful the longer we wait. So with substantial mitigation, we have a chance of a habitable future. Without substantial mitigation is going to be a very stark future for those in 2100. And so, excuse me, I'm just going to take a glass of water here. And so in a broader sense, whenever we're talking about population and its relation to environmental destruction and to climate change, I think, again, many of the links between population and the environment are well known. So worldwide, humans affect the planet in many different ways. We destroy wildlife habitats, causing species to go extinct. We change the chemistry of the oceans, we use resources at unsustainable rates, and as we're all well aware, we contribute to climate change. And many environmentalists have always been concerned about the continued growth of the human population for a variety of reasons, but largely because we understand that population growth correlates very linearly with increased resource use, consumption patterns, and environmental degradation in many cases. And historically, this has proven to be very true in a macro context. If you look historically, you'll see that fossil fuel production has increased in almost lockstep with population growth. And population pressures, as we're going to get into, actually contribute to a variety of social issues as well, which affect the environment, including things like increases in infant and maternal mortality, strains on resources, less access to resources, and so on. And so the Global Footprint Network actually estimates that humanity now demands 60% more of our planet than its ecosystems can renew. So that's a very, stunning statistic. But however, in order to maintain 85% of the world's biodiversity, which is very necessary in order for, to maintain a habitable and sustainable planet, not only now, but into future generations, the human demand should only use about half of what the planet can provide. And so this means that the current demand exceeds that goal by at least a factor of 3, according to the Global Footprint Network. And of course, climate change is a very complex issue, and there are a variety of contributors to climate change. And all of that needs to be addressed. Fossil fuel emissions, mainly produced in affluent countries, are one of the major contributors to climate change for sure. But there are many different other contributors as well. And the fact is, one of the most important factors behind this growing imbalance is the continued and sustained growth of the human population. And this should seem straightforward, right? But in mainstream culture, US culture, I think talking about population growth as it relates to environmental issues is actually contentious still. And as someone who works for an organization, that educates students and activists about the various social and environmental implications of rapid population growth, I know this to be very true. I don't know if many of you have experienced the same sentiments, but I think that this is pretty unfortunate, considering how vital addressing human population growth is to not only sustainable development, but climate change more broadly. And so why is this? And now I'm going to introduce my first of 2 polls. So I want to ask you, in your own experience in school or in literature or whatever, What are the biggest barriers to looking at population and environment studies? I'm gonna launch this poll. Okay, so it says, why do you think many environmentalists and climate activists hesitate to talk about population growth? And this is a multiple choice question, so you can answer one or all of them. And just to let you know, there's no real correct answer. Just interested to know what the audience thinks. Got about 67% of you guys who have voted. All right. If you haven't already answered, do so as soon as you can, please. We're going to get to the poll answers. All right, okay, I'm just going to end it now. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you think that it's hypocritical for Western countries to blame environmental degradation on poor regions, right? Because how could an affluent country like the United States, which uses the majority of the Earth's resources and consumes at rates that are astronomically higher than poor regions, how could we assert that population growth is in any way a contributor to climate change or environmental destruction? It's very true, right? How do we confront that? I'm going to stop sharing this. Thank you for your answers, everyone. And I just want to take a second to kind of outline some of the major, I think, inhibitors that I've seen against looking at population in environmental terms. And the first is the tendency for people to pit population against consumption. And that's kind of what the majority of you were alluding to whenever you answered that it's hypocritical for Western nations to look at population as an environmental problem. And this narrative is actually commonly used as a way to argue that talking about population growth and the environment is actually immoral or unethical. And again, that's because if we were to linearly compare population growth to consumption, we would see that consumption patterns and resource use varies widely throughout the world. And the fact that a small fraction of the world's population consumes the majority of the Earth's resources and produces a similarly disproportionate amount of CO2 is concerning whenever we're making this argument. So looking at population as a singular or exclusive contributor to global environmental problems like climate change is simply untrue, and it's a very dangerous oversimplification. And frankly, it misses the point, right? Instead, the conversation should be focused towards some of the major advantages associated with investing in smaller families and slowing population growth, both now and for future generations. And emanating from that discussion are concerns that population growth will be used as a basis to blame certain populations for global environmental crises, for which they were the least culpable, right? And in fact, oversimplified conclusions about the implications of population growth for mass famine and environmental change have actually been used as a basis to implement population control measures, which undoubtedly and inevitably carry racist, classist, xenophobic, and misogynistic undertones. And so rather, we need to be looking at the underlying causes of high fertility rates and the connections between things like rapid population growth and institutionalized poverty, exclusion, and marginalization and so forth. And from there, we need to figure out solutions that promote sustainable development across the world. The third is the use of trigger words. Population studies seem to be entangled with some really harmful trigger words that are very off-putting for those who are interested in promoting global environmental sustainability. And they rightfully do carry a heavy amount of historical or even contemporary baggage. Slowing population growth as a means to create a more sustainable future has nothing to do and has never had anything to do with population control. The term, frankly, should not be used, in my opinion. Any individual or organization engaged in population issues from human rights perspectives will never promote such a coercive or inherently flawed approach. Instead, we can look at future population projections and demographic trends in terms of empowerment and respect for people, the environment, the future, and so on. So perceived religious barriers, this was another popular answer in the poll. So striving for and maintaining a stable, sustainable population can really sometimes get caught up in religious debates that can be polarizing or divisive, often because they end up boiling down to very emotionally charged issues like abortion. And in these cases, it's really important to stick to the well-established facts regarding the drivers of sustainable development and the implications of rapid population growth and poverty and access on population. Religion does not actually have to be a barrier to creating a stable population. So take Iran, for example. Iran successfully brought its fertility rate down from 7 children per woman in about 1955 to well under replacement level fertility today. And while their policies have recently changed to now try to promote population growth, there's still, the example that they have set still proves that religion does not have to be a barrier. This is a very fundamentalist religious society that has, through the use of massive PR strategies led by the governments and the inclusion of religious leaders and increasing access to contraceptives and reproductive health care, really controlled its population in a way that through completely voluntary measures. And it serves as a success story for the ability for countries to, through human rights-based policies, create a more sort of stable population. And finally, and of course there are others, there are other sort of conceptual aversions to population that I'm not including here. But the final one is perhaps most important for this particular presentation. And it's that issues related to population and the environment should never convert to absolute statements that are untrue and again, carry historical baggage and hurt, right? For example, it's not helpful to say things like reducing population growth is the most important issue of our time, or the single most effective solution to climate change is to reduce the growth of the human population. So the world is a really, really complicated place, and climate change is an incredibly complex issue. And the assertion that there's one cause and one solution to any global problem or issue is both myopic and unprogressive. It's not helpful in progressing us forward. In fact, investing in smaller families and reducing fertility rates has immediate social benefits, but it does not have immediate environmental benefits in terms of offsetting carbon emissions. So for example, the need put forth by the IPCC to achieve a 45% carbon emission reduction by 2030 against 2010 levels can't actually be achieved through slowing population growth alone. However, in the long term, slowing population growth has the potential to outperform almost anything else. So this means that if the whole world were to adopt reproduction rates right now of Germany, Japan, Spain, Portugal, or Italy, all of them have below replacement level fertility rates, replacement level being 2.1. In 2100, if everybody were to adopt those reproduction rates, the world would host just above 4 billion people, as opposed to 11.6 or 11.2 billion people as forecasted by the UN. And even the latest projections put forth by the Lancet and the University of Washington which have drastically reduced the projected number of people on the planet. By 2100, still project that there's going to be around 8.7 or 8.8, I think, billion people by the end of the century. So if everybody were to implement, these measures now, we would have half of the Lancet's projection, which goes to just to show like how important the work we're doing is now, and how impactful population growth can be over the long term. Okay, so in terms of the global population, you can see that here that the growth of the global population has increased substantially in relatively recent years. So while growth rates are falling substantially and have been for quite a while, it's important to remember that historically, the growth of the human population has essentially skyrocketed since 1700. And in fact, up until 1800, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion people. And thanks in large part to advancements from the Industrial Revolution and large-scale increases in access to sanitation and public health and technology and so forth, we've now reached a point where we're adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. So remember, up until 1800, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion people, and we're now adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years, which is unprecedented in terms of growth. And so as the world's population continues to grow into 2100, it's important also to note that population growth is not happening evenly everywhere. And in fact, there are many places in the world where fertility rates are at or below replacement level. And in some cases, even countries are experiencing declines in populations, which is a completely separate issue. But if you take a look at this map, you'll see that the majority of the population growth is happening and projected to occur in places that are marginalized in respect to access to resources and economic opportunity. So high fertility rates is correlated very linearly with economic status. And this graph is based on the UN's medium variant projection, and it just helps clarify where the majority of the world's population is expected to grow into the future. So while the places with the very highest fertility rates are also among the most economically challenged, there are many places where the population is growing quickly alongside economic growth. And so to help clarify this, I just want to take a quick look at some of the ways that demography is set to influence the planet in upcoming years. So I think traditionally, if you were to look at the world, it's safe to assume that you've probably been told that there's two worlds. There's the developing world and the developed world. Hans Rosling, who was a famous statistician and demographer, has actually labeled that a complete oversimplification, and instead reconceptualize the world into different levels based off of relative population size and income. And as you can see, the majority of the world's population, or 5 billion people right now, are residing in middle income or emerging economies. And historically, as we've seen many times before, innovations in things like healthcare and advancements in technology and economic opportunity have helped increase the livelihoods and standards of living for people and societies at large. And this is exactly what's projected to happen with the nearly 5 billion people that are currently residing in these middle-income economies. For example, if you just take a quick look at China and all of the massive advancements that this country has made just in the last 50 years alone. It was once, called a developing country, and now at 1.4 billion people, this country is likely going to be on par with the rest of the most socioeconomically advanced societies in the world by basically now, by 2030 at the very least. And by the way, this is a really, really great thing. I mean, everybody deserves a better standard of living. Everyone deserves the ability to consume resources and increase livelihoods and live a comfortable life, right? Everyone. And increasing economic opportunity means increasing health overall, which ultimately means lower fertility rates. And it's a main driver of sustainable development. So everybody should be kind of promoting this, right? This is just achieving the demographic dividend. But within the context of these imminent threats posed by climate change, What will that mean for global environmental degradation that's set forth by things like consumption patterns, by resource use, by waste production, by habitat destruction, and so forth? And the fact that the world's poorest populations, actually level 1, according to Hans Rosling, people living on less than $2 a day on average, are actually the populations that are growing the fastest. And what that means for climate change is that more people are at risk of experiencing the effects of climate change who lack the ability or capital to readily respond or recover. And so the fact is there is a very direct correlation between high fertility rates and poverty. So places that are considered marginalized without access to vital resources such as clean water, healthcare, education, and economic opportunity, and so forth, tend also to have the highest overall fertility rates and the highest unmet need for contraceptives. And high fertility can impose a lot of very costly burdens on development as well. It impedes opportunities for economic development, increases health risks for women and children, erodes quality of life by reducing access to vital resources. Oh, I think now is my next poll for you guys. And I realize we're kind of running out of time, so I'm gonna just speed it up here. Wait. Second poll, true or false? 9 out of the 10 most climate vulnerable countries will experience high population growth rates into 2050. Now this is the test to see if you guys did your recommended readings. All right, I'm going to end the poll here in 5 seconds. If you haven't already submitted your answer, please do so. Looks like the majority of you have answered true. And true is the correct answer. So it is true that 9 out of the 10 most climate vulnerable countries will experience high population growth rates into 2050. And coupled with that, we have one more. High fertility rates are driven by high levels of unintended pregnancies and a lack of access to quality reproductive health care and education, especially for women and girls. Oh, we've got some quick learners in this group. Okay, 5 seconds to submit your question, please. All right, most of you got it right. Yes, it is also true that high fertility rates are driven by high levels of unintended pregnancies and a lack of access to quality reproductive health care for education, especially women and girls. And this is getting into the latter part of our presentation where we're looking at these connections between climate vulnerability, population growth, and access to health care. So thank you very much for answering and participating in these polls. I like them. Okay. So from both human rights and environmental perspectives, population growth is a very big deal, especially in terms of climate change. Again, the 9 out of the 10 most climate vulnerable countries are expected to experience rapid population explosions up until 2050 and beyond that as well. And so one of the primary lenses from which to view population and climate change is by understanding climate vulnerability. Rapid population growth, which is most prevalent in low-income regions, presents real challenges for sustainable development. And the 47 least developed countries are the fastest growing into 2050. So the links between population and climate change are very visible throughout the world. So due to geography, many low-income regions are already prone to things like droughts and flooding and natural disasters, all of which are going to increase substantially because of climate change. So one classic example of looking at like climate justice and climate impacts and vulnerability is Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is about the size of New York, but it has a population of around 164.7 million people in comparison to New York's 20 million. And New York's a very heavily populated state. The country Bangladesh is expected to exceed 200 million people by 2045, according to the UN's medium variant projection. So even though their fertility rates are not astronomically high, they're still experiencing a high amount of immigration and a high amount of population growth because of population momentum. And Bangladesh's population in general has doubled over the last 35 years, but its CO2 emissions still represent only 0.19% of the global total. So in essence, Bangladesh contributes a fraction of CO2 emissions in comparison to the US, so 0.4 metric tons to R17, but is projected to suffer major damage from sea level rise. It's projected that a 3-foot rise in sea level would submerge 20% of the country and displace more than 30 million people. And interestingly, from a population perspective, Bangladesh is considered a very prominent emerging economy that's expected to grow significantly in upcoming years. And the country is therefore experiencing large-scale urbanization, which also increases the threats posed by climate change relative to things like infrastructure, limits to resources, and so on. And indeed, Bangladesh, unfortunately, is experiencing large-scale flooding right now. This is a map that was published by the New York Times, which is looking at the flooding that's occurring in Bangladesh, which is a low elevation floodplain. So an estimated 24 to 37% of the country's landmass is now submerged. And nearly 1 million homes were pretty much instantly inundated, and 4.7 million people were affected. At least 54 people have died, most of them being children. I just found this last night. This is just an aerial image made by NASA of Bangladesh. As you can see, this is June 5th, and then this is July 25th, and the rains have not stopped yet. So this is an incredibly devastating situation for a very, very densely populated country. Another prime example of climate vulnerability is the Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa. So here temperatures are increasing alongside rapid population growth in a really sort of striking and staggering way. And this is exacerbating existing development issues and increasing risks posed by climate change. So in the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa, 100 to 200 million people will likely lack reliable food supplies in the next 30 to 40 years. And the Sahel region has grown from 31 people in 1950 and is projected to grow to 600 million people by 2100. So it's one of the fastest growing, I think it is actually the fastest growing place on the planet in terms of a region. And temperatures here are rising 1.5 times faster than the global average. And future projections show an increase of 3 degrees Celsius to 5 degrees Celsius above 2013 levels by 2050. 50. So this is basically going to make food production and subsistence-based agriculture, which is very common in that region, impossible. And lack of access to resources and large-scale environmental change, coupled with rapid environmental growth or rapid population growth, again, is creating a very devastating humanitarian problem that will only continue to worsen. So climate change is causing increasingly frequent droughts and floods, which undermine food production in a region where over 80% of farmland is already degraded. So in the wake of these very scary projections and impending humanitarian crises, the ability to reduce fertility and slow population growth through voluntary measures would greatly reduce the pressures felt by declining food production, overcrowding, and so forth. And for this reason, as we start to close out the presentation, we're going to talk about some of the sort of positive impacts that increasing access to education and healthcare can provide via slower population growth. So population growth especially in low-income regions that are experiencing climate impacts, it hinders development by increasing hunger, resource use, greenhouse gas emissions, and habitat destructions. And so we really need to be focused on investments that facilitate sustainable development and that are integrated, meaning that they address the environmental, the social, and the economic aspects of development. And increasing access to comprehensive reproductive health care is actually one very important solution to an adaptation strategy for climate change. So access to sexual and reproductive health care, in addition to education, can actually influence population dynamics through voluntary reductions in fertility and by lowering infant and maternal mortality rates. So quality, comprehensive reproductive health care increases the health, welfare, and life expectancy of women and children, advances individuals' rights, reduces poverty, and slows population growth. And together, these benefits help strengthen environmental sustainability as well as state stability as well. And from an environmental perspective, family planning is being increasingly recognized as a critical human rights-based and cost-effective approach to climate change adaptation and resilience building. And of course, the ability for countries to effectively and equitably respond to climate change is going to require many different comprehensive solutions. And ultimately, it's predicated on a greater understanding of the interrelated development connections between and challenges. And in this way, family planning and education play a very, very important role in reducing climate vulnerability and can act as an adaptation strategy. And one reason for this is that these solutions, education and family planning, the tools gained by people who are able to access these resources are transferred to subsequent generations. And so over time, these benefits compound. And so recent research in an environmental context has also shown that meeting the global unmet need for family planning can reduce emissions quite substantially. It has the ability to reduce 85 gigatons of CO2 between now and 2050, which is equivalent to closing 22,000 coal-fired power plants. Family planning, as we're going to get into later on in the course, is also extremely cost-effective. So the emissions averted through investments in family planning are actually much cheaper in comparison to other options like solar power and carbon capture from new coal plants. And so this graphic was redone by our designer, but it was originally put forth by Project Drawdown, which is a nonprofit that offers one of the most comprehensive and realistic sets of available solutions to climate change. So this is a nonprofit that produces research, which is based off of the work of scientists and researchers around the world and across many different sectors, from finance to climate science. And so in the book, the solutions that are presented are ranked in order of their potential impact for addressing climate change and their projected emissions impact globally. And as you can see by looking at this infographic, health and education, family planning and education actually rank second in a very long list of potential solutions. So the impact, both socially and environmentally, is very significant and compelling. And so as we just end, this is, again, just an intro to population and climate change, and we're going to get into some of the different connections later on in the course. But it's important to remember as we're closing out that worldwide, the same regions that experience high fertility, low economic status, and high climate vulnerability also have a really high unmet need for contraceptives and reproductive healthcare services. And for this reason, the world's most marginalized populations are also the most vulnerable to climate change. And this is a little bit of an older map, but it's just kind of showing what we've been talking about, which is family planning needs compared to population growth and climate change hotspots. And as you can see, there's a very clear correlation between the three. Okay, so reproductive health in the Sahel. So for example, if people were able to access resources and if the unmet need for family planning were to be met in the Sahel, it would be very impactful, because right now contraceptive use is actually below 10%. And this varies according to country. But even those that have adopted policies to reduce fertility are still, experiencing large-scale either social, political, or cultural barriers to access to care. And in Bangladesh, as I was talking about before, contraceptive use is actually quite high. It's increased 7-fold in the last 40 years, from 8% to 62% in 2014. And the fertility rate has been quite low ever since then, but there is still an unmet need for family planning. So 1/3 of pregnancies in this country are still unintended, which signals an unmet need for family planning. So the total fertility rate could be 30% lower if unplanned pregnancies were to be avoided. And this is going to require commitments from governments and organizations who are able to monitor the progress and implement broad-scale solutions. All right, so in conclusion, for this first class, what we want to make sure you guys remember is that population growth contributes to climate vulnerability around the world and increases the climate impacts and emissions around the world. But slowing population growth through voluntary family planning will positively affect global efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change and will increase resilience for populations who are most at risk. And finally, investments in comprehensive reproductive health care do foster sustainable development and reduce climate impacts globally. And again, this is something that we're going to get into in much greater depth throughout the course. So I'm going to end with this quote, which was written by Paul Hawken, who was one of the main editors for Drawdown. And it says, "Honoring the dignity of women and children through family planning is not about centralized governments forcing the birth rate down or up through natalist policies, nor is it about agencies or activists in rich countries where emissions are highest, telling people elsewhere to stop having children. It is most essentially about freedom and opportunity for women and the recognition of basic human rights." All right, and with that, we can open it up for discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for supplying questions. If you think of more right now as Hannah's answering some of them, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try to get to all of them. I would say if we run out of time, then just feel free to email Hannah directly, or you can send an email to engage@popconnect.org, and we'll get back to you via email. Okay, so the first question is, how would the repeal of the Helms Amendment affect global population and environmental health?
Well, that is actually a really important factor. Repealing the Helms Amendment would allow for increased US aid for family planning programs internationally, which is what we really need to be doing in order to, for both humanitarian and environmental reasons. So right now, the global gag rule is the policy that that has limited the way that aid is distributed to different countries throughout the world. And that is because of a policy that has been implemented that restricts such access. So the Helms Amendment is really significant in reducing these aid barriers that we're currently seeing from the United States.
All right. Question number 2 that we received is, what does Population Connection feel is the single most important action the US government can take to reduce the advance of climate change?
Sorry, can you read that one more time?
Sure. What does Population Connection feel is the single most important action the US government can take to reduce the advance of climate change?
Well, that's a good question. I think that as an organization that focuses on the implications of population growth and increasing access to healthcare, we would obviously always advocate for reducing policy barriers that affect aid distribution internationally, because our focus is to increase access to family planning. But as we were kind of talking about throughout this presentation, access to family planning is just one aspect of a much broader set of solutions that need to be addressed. And I think the major takeaway in understanding climate change and putting forth solutions is that things are complicated, things are intertwined. It's not nearly as effective to tackle issues in isolation. So solutions that are integrated, meaning that they address both the social, the environmental, and other aspects of development, like economic development, are the most advantageous in the long term.
All right. Another question is, did Iran use contraception to slow population growth? And someone did sort of answer this in the chat further down, but I thought you'd still want to speak to it, Hannah. Give some more detail.
Yeah. Yes. So Iran, in the wake of very high fertility rates that were making it hard for the country to develop, the government implemented a sweeping plan that included free access to contraceptives for the public, massive PR campaigns that were condoning the use of contraceptives and the advantages associated with smaller families. And they actually, I think one reason that they were so successful in this is because they did include religious leaders in this process. And the religious leaders acted in some ways as spokespeople for the advantages of smaller families. So yes, contraceptives and access were a big part of that.
Okay. All right. At one point, you've used it multiple times, Hannah. You used the term marginalized, and so there was a question if you could clarify what you mean by that term.
So marginalized populations is kind of a term that I use to describe low-income populations who have historically been colonized, both literally and economically, and that are attempting to develop with sort of constraints in place. So I'm speaking a lot about places in Africa and Latin America that have through no real fault of their own, experienced developmental challenges that have inhibited progress, even despite access to a lot of different natural resources throughout the country.
All right. When you were speaking about the flooding right now, someone asked, do women in Bangladesh and the Sahel and these other regions, do they have access to contraceptives?
So it totally depends on where you're looking. In the Sahel, where population growth rates are the highest, contraceptive use is quite low. And again, that has some correlations to poverty, but it also it's very complex. So you need to take it sort of situationally and look at it country by country, because it's very much dependent on the policies there and the sort of cultural implications of contraceptives. But in the Sahel, contraceptive use is low. In Bangladesh, the total fertility rates is low in comparison to other sort of middle-income countries. But as I was kind of saying, there's still a high amount of unintended pregnancies, which signals an unmet need for contraceptives and likely education. Bangladesh has invested a lot recently in family planning, education, and reproductive health care, and because of that, they've been able to, drastically reduce their fertility rates.
All right. Next question was, someone asked if the growth interval of adding 1 billion people for 12 or 14 years, will that interval get smaller going forward due to geometric growth? So sort of a J-curve growth pattern. So will we start adding 1 billion people more rapidly?
Yeah, that's just, it's totally dependent on where we go from here. Again, if everybody were to adopt like lower replacement level fertility rates right now, then our world would look completely different than the projections. And the projections that are put forth by the UN take into consideration and assume an increase in contraceptive use. So while we can look at these and kind of assume based on based on what's happened historically that they may be true, they're also, it's important to remember that these projections are very much dependent on increases in access to contraceptives and reproductive health care. And that also can change. So it's very much dependent on, you know, the level of unintended pregnancies and the access to resources globally.
And I can add just a tiny bit of detail that I got while I was going through these questions, Hannah, just to add on to what you were saying is, right, the U.S. and high-income countries have been in a linear growth pattern since the 1960s, but it's places such as sub-Saharan Africa where contraceptive access is still not widespread enough, where the growth rate is really rapid, and that's where we're still seeing exponential growth. So that gives a little more nuance to it. Okay. So the next question is, what is the rate of contraceptive use in high-income countries?
The rate of contraceptive use in high-income countries?
Yes.
Again, that totally depends on where you're talking about and the policies that are in effect in particular countries. And again, the sort of cultural associations relative to contraceptive use. I know in the United States, 45% of pregnancies are unintended, and contraceptive use is relatively high, but there are there have been recently and are kind of always these barriers that are put forth by politicians who have who sort of claim to have this like moral obligation to reduce access to reproductive care. So especially with the onset of this pandemic, we've seen increases in people trying to reduce access. And again, it just totally depends. I think in a lot of Western Europe, contraceptive use is quite high. And their fertility rates are accordingly low.
Makes sense. All right. We also had a question about the role of educating boys to delay starting families and what part that might play in slowing population growth.
Yeah, I think that's a really important and essential aspect of family planning and education. I think that, in addition to just providing access to reproductive care, people need to understand why that's beneficial to them and why they should be, interested in using contraceptives. And there are a lot of sort of like historically like obsolete, but still very significant cultural barriers where people value very high family sizes and things. But I think developmentally speaking, if you look historically, then what like the major indicator of lower fertility rates is like development overall. And as people start to gain more access to resources and education at higher levels and contraceptives and things, then fertility rates do naturally drop because people have fewer and healthier children. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, we'll just do one more question because we realize that it's already past 3. How do you think we could encourage smaller families, particularly in countries like the US?
Well, and sorry, I just realized that I kind of overlooked the last question. Including boys in the whole process is extremely vital, and especially in patriarchal cultures where, again, there's like a very sort of significant perception of what's acceptable and what's considered advantageous in terms of family structure. That can all change with education, because as societies start to develop, it becomes more and more expensive to actually have children, and less advantageous. So boys and men need to be included in both family planning structures and in education. And then the last question, sorry, Natalie, what was it?
Oh, it was what could we do to encourage smaller families?
Oh, well, I think that for one, we need to make sure that we're always encouraging reproductive autonomy. We are encouraging empowerment and respect. And we want to make sure that anyone, has the ability to access the resources they need to control their own reproduction and decide when, whether, and how many children they want to have. And again, we never want to say like there's a perfect number of children to have, or you shouldn't have any children at all, or anything like that. If people want to have 8 children, then that's their prerogative, and they should be able to do so, right? And if we're looking at things from a just human rights perspective. But again, historically, if we look and see and the trajectory of like developed countries, who started out with really high population growth rates, with increases in access to resources and education and economic opportunity and things, fertility rates naturally drop. So we should be focusing on sustainable development initiatives that increase the livelihoods and standards of living for people, so that they're then able to increase their family size over time just naturally. And that's happened almost like unanimously across the board in different countries.
All right. Okay, so that takes us past time already. Thank you, Hannah, for answering all those questions. I put it in the chat, but in case everyone didn't see it, if you have further questions, if you want more detail to anything that Hannah spoke about today, please email us at engage@popconnect.org, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. And then some sort of housekeeping. If you haven't registered for the second course or the rest of them, please go to our website and do so if you're interested. If you go to the homepage and scroll down, you'll see a link to the entire course, and that's the easiest way to find it. You can also email us at Engage once again, and we can get you registered that way. And we'll also be sharing a recording of the presentation by early next week, and we'll be doing that for all of these going forward, and they'll be posted on our website as well. So you'll be able to access everything that was spoken about, as well as all the slides that Hannah shared.
Yes, thank you all very much.
All right. Okay, thank you, everyone. We
See you next
appreciate
week.
you joining us. See you next Thursday.
Bye-bye.